I open by giving the floor to the Council, Madam Kalniņa-Lukaševica. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, dear Commissioner, honourable members, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the European Parliament for giving me the opportunity to address you on the important issue of EU-Turkey relations. Let me begin by emphasising that Turkey is a very significant partner for the EU. Its dynamic economy provides a valuable contribution to the prosperity of the European continent. I would like to underline in this regard the important regional role of Turkey and its active involvement in its wider neighbourhood. The European Union has repeatedly reaffirmed the importance it attaches to our relations. 2 days ago, the EU-Turkey Association Council held its 53rd meeting in Brussels. It was a valuable meeting in relations between the EU and Turkey, despite diverging positions on certain issues. I want to start today with positive developments in our relations. There have been a number of important positive signals in our relations over the last year. First, we welcome the dialogue and cooperation on foreign policy issues. In particular, active counter-terrorism dialogue between the EU and Turkey and exchange of best practices on the prevention of radicalisation and recruitment to terrorism. The attacks in Paris, Belgium and Denmark prove how important such steps are. We should develop closer cooperation against ISIL, Daesh and its funding networks, and enhance our effort to stem the flow of foreign fighters. Secondly, we acknowledge the important regional role Turkey plays. Here, I would like to praise the considerable efforts made by Turkey in hosting around 2 million refugees fleeing the violence in Syria and Iraq. The EU will continue to support Turkey so it can deal effectively with the increasing flow of refugees, including through financial assistance. And thirdly, we have seen the ratification of the EU readmission agreement and the ongoing dialogue on visa liberalisation. In this regard, we expect a full and effective implementation of the agreement by Turkey towards all EU member states. This equally applies to the visa roadmap. Dear colleagues, now let me turn to the accession negotiations with Turkey. Further progress in the accession negotiations requires political will and courage, and is in the interest of all of us. In this context, we welcome the strong commitment to EU accession displayed by the Turkish government in its EU strategy and look forward to its concrete follow-up. Progress under Chapter 17, Economic and Monetary Policy, would in due course further support economic dialogue between Turkey and the EU and encourage alignment with the acquis. The mentioning of Chapter 17 brings me to reiterating that active and credible accession negotiations which respect the EU's commitments and establish conditionality will enable our relations to achieve their full potential. In line with the negotiating framework, the EU continues to encourage Turkey to develop its foreign policy in coordination with the EU and to progressively align with EU common foreign and security policy. I would also like to remind that Turkey needs to commit itself fully to good neighbourly relations and to the peaceful settlement of disputes in line with the negotiating framework and previous European Council conclusions. Let me remind that the European Council on the 24th of October 2014 expressed serious concern about the tension in the Eastern Mediterranean. It urged Turkey to respect Cyprus' sovereignty over its territorial sea and Cyprus' sovereign rights in its exclusive economic zone. Under those circumstances, the European Council considers it more important than ever to ensure a positive climate so that negotiations for a comprehensive Cyprus settlement can resume. Turkey's commitment and contribution in concrete terms to such a comprehensive settlement is crucial, and we certainly welcome the resumption of talks which took place this last Friday, on the 15th of May. The opening of further negotiation chapters continues to deepen our fulfilment of requirements of the negotiating framework and the accession partnership. Turkey's full and non-discriminatory implementation of the additional protocol to the Association Agreement towards all Member States could also provide a significant boost to the negotiation process. Let me reiterate that the EU is determined to continue to help Turkey in its reform efforts, with a view to advancing the negotiations as soon as the respective conditions are met. The pace of negotiations can be accelerated by Turkey advancing in the fulfilment of benchmarks, by meeting the requirements of the negotiation framework and by respecting its contractual obligations toward the EU. Honourable Members, this brings me to my next point, which concerns domestic developments in Turkey. The EU extends our strongest political support to the renewed efforts towards a peaceful settlement of the Kurdish issue. We encourage further engagement by all parties to move the process forward. Concerning the ongoing reforms, we welcome the continued implementation of reforms adopted in previous years and, in particular, measures announced in the democratisation package. We are, however, concerned with undue interference by the executive in the judiciary, frequent changes to key legislation without due consultation of stakeholders, and restrictions on access to information. The Council, in its conclusions of December 2014, addressed the issue of rule of law and respect for human rights, including rights for women, children and persons belonging to minorities, freedom of religion and property rights. Freedoms and reforms should also enhance implementation of all the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. Last year, we also expressed regret with the continued response by the government to the alleged cases of corruption. These actions have caused serious doubts over the independence and impartiality of the judiciary and demonstrated an increasing intolerance of political opposition, public protest and critical media. The police raids and the detention of a number of journalists and media representatives in Turkey in December 2014, on which you, honourable members of Parliament, also issued a resolution expressing your concerns, call into the question the respect for media freedom, which is a core principle of democracy. Let me underline that legislation on the right of association and the right of assembly should be brought in line with European standards. In this regard, we emphasise the important role of the Constitutional Court, and we note positively the growing engagement of civil society in Turkey. It should be further supported and encouraged as a legitimate stakeholder. We consider that stepping up cooperation with the EU and strengthening common activities in the area of rule of law and fundamental rights will bring Turkey closer to the EU and speed up work on possible future discussions in these key areas. To conclude, we firmly believe that the EU should remain the anchor of political and economic reforms in Turkey. and we continue to encourage to work on implementation of reforms. And in the end, I would like to thank the rapporteur, Ms. Kati PIRI, on the tremendous work you have put into the resolution. The number of amendments is impressive and testifies to the great importance the European Parliament attaches to the EU's relations with Turkey. Thank you all for a well-balanced and comprehensive end product. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. We were very interested in the position of the Council. That's why we allowed you double time as it was foreseen, but thank you very much for that. So now for the Commission, Commissioner Stylianides, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, President, honorable members, dear colleagues. I'm here today to deliver the following statement on behalf of Commissioner Hahn, dear colleagues, who is responsible for neighbourhood policy, who unfortunately could not be here today due to the Riga summit. First, I would like to thank the rapporteur on Turkey, Mrs. Kati PIRI, for delivering a high-quality report and for her endless efforts in brokering compromises. The report is balanced and addresses the key elements of European Union-Turkey relations, both in terms of achievements and challenges. In order to tackle the serious global and regional challenges that we share, we need to engage Turkey even more. The human tragedies in the Mediterranean, the threats posed by terrorist groups, the severe conflicts in our neighbourhood, and also the economy and climate change are all issues we cannot effectively face alone. Concerning migration and border management, as noted by the European Council in April, there is more generally a pressing need to reinforce our cooperation with Turkey on managing these issues, including the fight against smuggling of migrants. At a working dinner last Sunday, Federica Mogherini and Johannes Hahn and Turkey's ministers Çavuşoğlu and Bozkır agreed to work together to prepare a plan on reinforced cooperation. This underlines also the high level of importance we attach to the visa liberalisation dialogue. The situation in Syria and Iraq has called for the reinforcement of our cooperation on foreign policy issues and counter-terrorism. Turkey has made remarkable efforts to host about 2 million Syrian and Iraqi refugees and deserves our full support in coping with this immense burden. Turning to the Cyprus issue, the Commission believes that the time has come for all involved to embrace the current opportunity to solve the problem. The Commission stands firmly behind the UN envoy Espen Aide in his efforts to get the communities in Cyprus to successfully continue the settlement talks. The Commission strongly encourages all relevant stakeholders, including Turkey, to contribute to a positive climate. Dear colleagues, Turkey has marked a renewed commitment to the accession process, notably through a new EU strategy and corresponding action plans. It is in the interest of both the EU and Turkey that the EU remains the anchor for Turkey's political and economic reforms. We are in particular determined to fully tap into the huge potential of our economic relations. The Commission is also actively working towards developing a high-level economic dialogue and making progress towards the opening of Chapter 17 on economic and monetary policy, for which technical preparations are underway. Last week, Commissioner Malmström and Minister for Economy Georgios EPITIDEIOS, building on important preparatory work, have endorsed the process of enhancing and deepening of EU-Turkey trade relations and of upgrading of the Customs Union Agreement to improve its structure and function. The Commission will now be launching internal procedures, including a comprehensive impact assessment, in order to seek negotiating directives from the Council. The Commission intends to keep the relevant committees of this Parliament regularly informed on this important process. Regarding energy security, in March, Maroš Šefčovič, Vice President, launched a high-level energy dialogue and attended the start of the works on the TANAP Trans-Anatolian gas pipeline, which, once completed, will contribute to Europe's energy security. Regarding developments in Turkey, we share most of the views and concerns raised in your report on the rule of law and the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms. These are key areas where Turkey needs to make proof of its commitment to the accession process. We hope to see Turkey re-engage in reforms in line with European standards and values, and actively consult all stakeholders. By providing a clear roadmap for reforms, defining the opening benchmarks for chapters 23 and 24 will be in the interest of both Turkey and the EU. The Commission is ready to help, including through our pre-accession assistance. Our assistance is to be based on sector reform strategies and result-oriented, with the aim to increase its impact and visibility. To conclude, the Commission has high expectations for our cooperation with Turkey. After the election, I hope to see the new government and parliament re-energize the EU agenda in Turkey. It will also be an excellent opportunity for members of the European Parliament, dear colleagues, to engage with your Turkish counterparts in a constructive manner on positive achievements as well as challenges. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Now we open the debate with speakers from the political groups. The first speaker is Madam Piri, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for the contributions of the Council and the Commission to this debate. The EU and Turkey are important strategic partners, and it is in the interest of both to have a close and effective cooperation, and we encourage Turkey to accelerate the pace of negotiations by clearly committing itself to respecting democratic values and principles. The European Parliament continues to support the EU accession process of Turkey as the cornerstone of our relations. However, in the report, which will be voted tomorrow, we ask the Commission to make a reassessment of the way in which the negotiations with Turkey have been conducted so far, and how things can be further improved and intensified. In a time that we ourselves are having intensive discussions in the EU, also this morning in this chamber, on how adequate protection can be given to refugees, we commend and praise all the efforts made by the Turkish government for hosting more refugees than any other country in the world today. If we want to make sure that those in need of protection can find a safe haven in the region, we need to step up our efforts to actively assist Turkey in providing adequate shelter, healthcare and education for refugees and their children. Another area where we strongly support and encourage efforts by the Turkish government and all other stakeholders is to achieve a comprehensive and sustainable conclusion to the peace process with the Kurdish community. But there is also clear concern in this Parliament about certain developments in Turkey. These are issues at the core of the negotiation process, such as the independence of the judiciary, the freedom of expression and the freedom of the press. The pressure put on media outlets and journalists, which often results in intimidation, dismissal or even arrest of journalists and wide self-censorship, is of great concern to all of us. The recently adopted security package is, in our view, very wide in scope and bypasses the judiciary. Most investigations into the events that occurred in Gezi Park in May and June 2013 are still pending, and too little progress has been made in identifying the alleged perpetrators. We believe that the EU should remain a benchmark for reforms in the country. That means that we do not want to shut the door to Turkey, but we actually call for more dialogue and intensified engagement. The Parliament report provides several proposals of areas where we believe it is of mutual benefit to increase the cooperation. This is in the area of foreign and security policy, anti-terrorism, energy security, but also, of course, specifically in the field of fundamental rights. Delivering the official opening benchmarks and the subsequent opening of chapters 23 and 24, which has also just been raised by the Commission representative here, are the best way to promote truly effective reforms. We are ready to support Turkey in developing solid democratic institutions and effective legislation based on the respect for human rights, the rule of law and defending the interests of all sectors of Turkish society. Finally, the Parliament also reiterates its strong support for the reunification of Cyprus on the basis of a fair, comprehensive and viable settlement for both communities. We very much welcome the fact that the leaders of both communities have officially resumed negotiations under the auspices of the UN, and we believe that there is a unique window of opportunity now for a shared solution to the benefit of all Cypriots. We expect that Turkey and all relevant stakeholders will play a positive and constructive role in this delicate process. And let me just raise here also my gratitude and my thanks to all the shadow rapporteurs of this Parliament on the Turkey report, because if this wouldn't have been a joint exercise, it would have been very difficult to stand here. So I'm very happy that we have a united position in this Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take blue cards after the first speakers from each political group, just for your information. So now the floor goes to Madam Sommer for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Well, first of all, I would like to start by thanking the Parliament's rapporteur, Kati PIRI. We've been working together for weeks and months now, and I'd also like to thank the shadow rapporteurs from the other groups. We've had very difficult debates, but I think that we've managed to get very good agreements. Everybody knows in this House how difficult it is to get agreement on the topic of Turkey, so that's something we need to appreciate and recognise. Well, something else we also need to recognise. Well, this is an anniversary. In October, it's going to be 10 years since the start of accession negotiations with Turkey. But just as the negotiations started, it seems that the desire to reform ended in this country, and it seems that we've been seeing only steps backwards ever since. Turkey is distancing itself step by step from the European Union. Turkey has not complied with the Copenhagen criteria on any single area. There are interferences in fundamental rights and citizenship rights. The rule of law is simply trodden on in a country that has been a candidate for accession for a long time now. The relationship with Cyprus has not changed. Well, I won't go into that in detail. I'm sure a lot of other colleagues will do that. We are hoping for an improvement nevertheless. Well, I think it's wrong to demand for the opening of further chapters in the negotiations. I think that would actually support the government in the electoral campaign. They would see that as a reward for their anti-democratic policies. I think that we need a reassessment of the whole negotiation process. The Commission and the Council of Ministers should think very carefully about how we can move forward. Turkey is indeed important for us as a trusted neighbour, as a trading partner, as an important partner in energy security and an important partner in combating terror. Turkey does a lot of work for supporting the refugees that it's sheltering. That's something that also deserves their recognition. But no, unfortunately, Turkey has not come close to the fundamental values of the European Union. It's very much the contrary. That's a very sad situation, and we need to say that loud and clear as the European Parliament. That's our job. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Van Orden for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Well, I mean, it's some 50 years, I think, since Turkey first put forward her application to join the European community. I must say I welcome the Commissioner's undertaking to re-energise the relationship with Turkey, but in spite of lip service to Turkish accession, there is a fundamental dishonesty about whether or not Turkey will ever join the sort of EU that we have today. And I have to say that many, not just in my own country, but across Europe, would like to see a fundamentally different sort of European Union. A less tightly knit community of sovereign nations with overlapping circles of engagement and an end to ever closer union and a primary focus on making a success of the single market. And I would suggest that that is the sort of European Union that would be far more hospitable to Turkey. The resolution reflects the ambivalence on the European Union side, recognising on the one hand the importance of Turkey's position as a strategic partner, and particularly her significance in economic and energy relations, while on the other hand there is so much about Turkey itself which is subject to criticism. And we can't go on offering insults and expecting progress in return. Energy cooperation is a crucial issue. We should oppose the Turkish Stream project, which would bring Russian gas across the Black Sea to Turkey, and work towards the opening of Chapter 15 in order to encourage Turkey to continue to engage with the European Union instead. And may I ask the Commission, what are the specific barriers to opening the energy chapter with Turkey? For many, the continued division of Cyprus is a useful obstacle to progress in relations with Turkey. And if the EU really wanted to do something useful, it would devote much political effort in helping to resolve the Cyprus issue. Such a resolution would even be helpful in boosting economic and political confidence in Greece, may I say. Instead, the European Union continues to make lame, one-sided demands about, for example, the additional protocol, while failing to fulfil its own promises in regard to Northern Cyprus. And the new President of Northern Cyprus, Mr. Akinci, has shown great willingness to reach an accommodation. What more will the EU do to help? Madam Chairman, we need to make sure that Turkey continues to play its vital role as a strong ally in NATO and a partner of the European Union, part of the alliance confronting terrorism and instability in the Middle East and across the Black Sea, with a prosperous economy and anchored firmly in the democratic family of nations. We do need to do more to help Turkey in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lambsdorff, 2 minutes.
Vielen Dank, Frau Präsidentin. Vor 10 Jahren Thank you, Madam President. 10 years ago, accession negotiations were taken up with Turkey, and this was decided by Council at recommendation of the Commission. This was a deeply misachieved and unthought through move. There were a lot of countries against bringing Turkey in, and our friends in Ankara, Istanbul and Turkey know that. If Council declares today that the European Union is the anchor of political reforms in Turkey still, I wonder what planet you're living on. Turkey is reforming as it sees fit, in the direction they want to go, in the direction that the democratically elected government of the country wants to take it. Unfortunately, with the first political Copenhagen criterion, this doesn't have much of a connection. And Madam President in Office of Council, we've heard there is serious danger for press freedom, justice is not guaranteed, the freedom of assembly is not guaranteed. These are vital criteria for the allowing of a country into the European Union, and that's precisely why we're calling for a re-evaluation of this entire process, and specifically a constructive re-evaluation. No one in this country quarrels with the fact that Turkey is and must be a strong strategic ally of the EU. There's so much we can do that is good together with them, with energy policy in mind, or people-to-people contact, or visa facilitation, research, universities, culture. There's so much that can be done. All this overlaid with an accession process which has led to a poisoning of relations because it's so dishonest. And that's why I think it's really decisive that this new re-evaluation be undertaken constructively together, so that the EU and Turkey, marking the 100th anniversary of the Turkish state in 2023, will still be a strong partner, and we won't have repelled each other through this process.
Mr. HADJIGEORGIOU, 1 minute and a half.
My dear colleagues, the report we are discussing for us includes many positive elements. Unfortunately, some negative ones. I'm going to mention them later. Personally, I would mention the new effort to resolve the problem of Cyprus. It's an issue that concerns also this report. Perhaps we have real possibilities of a settlement now, and I feel that the European Union, through its representatives, should follow closely the new procedure. I call the President of the European Parliament, the representative of the Council, and Mr. Juncker in particular, to be present in the negotiations in order to assure that the proposals made agree with the acquis communautaire and that the final solution will be inspired by the fundamental values of the European Union. If the two leaders, and here I salute Mr. Mustafa Kidzi, who became a leader of the Northern Cypriot community. If so, they find solutions, they make good proposals, they should be pressures on Turkey for issues concerning Turkey, the guarantees and the army. A member state doesn't need guarantees and rights to intervene. And when a solution is found, the army has to be withdrawn. The report refers to Cyprus, the Kurdish problem, and the human rights in Turkey. We do not agree with the opening of the chapters mentioned. And I thank Mrs. Piri for the culture she showed, the high level of culture during the discussion with the political groups. The solution, my dear colleagues, will send a very bright message within the European Union, but also abroad, and this message is something that is needed by our old continent. Thank you.
Thank you. So next speaker is Madam Ceballos for 2 minutes and 30.
Thank you very much, President. Well, I'd like to start by thanking the speakers and the shadow rapporteurs. They've been extremely patient to try and put together compromises that other groups can come behind. I realise that the groups have different opinions, but different countries have different opinions too. In Sweden there's strong political support for Turkish membership of the EU, which might seem quite strange. It's particularly strange that some groups couldn't deal with any wording that involving the word accession and preferred the term negotiations instead. we would rather they spoke about accession directly in the text rather than negotiations merely. Well, even if we're in favour of accession to the EU, we do realise it's also our responsibility to criticise when we see developments moving in the wrong direction. You can certainly see that in the area of media freedom and the possibility for the opposition to act freely. The government is trying to prevent critical voices using state-owned media infrastructure, and that's not acceptable. There should be no restrictions on freedom of expression or freedom of the media. What we're also very keen to ensure is that the upcoming elections are going to be free and fair. But if they are not so, then of course we must raise our voice and criticise. It's important to the Turkish people as well. As for the Turks, for the Kurds, we do need to ensure that there is enough aid going to them, and I think it's absolutely unacceptable if aid convoys are being sent back. Turkey's borders are very important. Neither the Turks nor the Kurds have got anything to benefit from further conflict between the two sides. Let's hope that we can help to promote peaceful development in the whole region. I would also like to ask for support for our amendment number 9. This is on Turkey's environmental responsibility, and we would like to call upon Turkey to carry out proper impact assessments, rather, just as we do when we launch energy projects in the European Union. Thank you very much.
Mr. Affronte, for 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. We know that Turkey is a strategic partner for the European Union in economic, geopolitical and energy security terms, but we also know it's not putting in place the necessary reforms and doesn't have the necessary legal system based on democracy and the rule of law. What do we make of a government that doesn't grant full social and political rights to citizens of a Kurdish origin? How should we interpret the 9th year of no action taken on the undertakings made in the accession agreement with Turkey? How can we accept in Europe a country which isn't aligned with the fundamental values on which the EU is based, without an independent judicial system in which the most basic rights of justice, freedom and security are still denied, a country in which workers don't have the right to protest or to strike? In light of all that, we wonder whether Turkey really intends to do its utmost to satisfy the criteria required for accession, or whether perhaps we should mark a pause for thought on the very idea of accession. Thank you.
Mr. Epitideiois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As all we know, after 2000, when the discussion started for the accession of Turkey to the European Union, very little progress has been made. Each government in Turkey knows very well that the country does not agree with the criteria of Copenhagen to become a member of the European Union. However, instead of trying to make an effort for progress, Turkey accuses the European Union. It says that the European Union is responsible for the delays of the accession procedures, and she asks for an acceleration for the procedures. Turkey is good to follow that policy. It's for its own interests. My question is, why in the European Parliament, but in the other institutions of the European Union, do we have officials who instead of demanding from Turkey to conform to its obligations, are pressuring those who are asking the self-evident to agree to open new chapters, such as chapter 15 for the energy issues, in order for Turkey to do the necessary reforms? This is an utopia and makes Turkey more provocative. When Turkey is threatening Greece with war and denies the existence of Cyprus, and illegally it occupies a part of it, as long as this happens, we, the Greek nationalists, will not allow Turkey to enter Europe from the back door. Thank you.
Mr. Preda, 1 minute and a half.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, I'd like to make it clear I'm not speaking today in my capacity as the EPP coordinator for foreign affairs, because our group is very divided on this matter. I'd like to say something going back to what I said in February when I travelled with Foreign Affairs Committee colleagues to Turkey. And on that occasion we had some very high-level meetings with the President, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister. We told our partners, for instance, that the Parliament was intending to debate and vote on a resolution on the Armenian genocide, which, as you know, we did. And we said to our partners as well that we would be discussing the Kati PIRI report, which we're now doing. And we were in favour of opening up new negotiating chapters with Turkey. And I think we need to keep our word, we need to keep faith with that, and vote tomorrow in favour of the amendments seeking to open up new chapters. Whether we're talking about justice and the rule of law or energy, I believe it's important for us to deepen our dialogue with Turkey. And also, we can't ignore internal political developments, and we await with interest to see the elections to be held in Turkey in a few weeks, which is a very sensitive issue, particularly with regard to the People's Democratic Party, which is a pro-Kurd movement. Thank you very much for your attention.
You have a blue card from Mr. Paet. Would you agree, Mr. Preda, with the blue card?
Yes.
Mr. Paet, you can ask your question to Mr. Preda.
Thank you, dear colleague. For years, the European Union has discussed how necessary it is to cooperate with Turkey in security and other matters, considering what's going on in the Near East. Yet, unfortunately, there's very little cooperation, also in energy policy. What do you think could be the concrete steps that the European Union could do to support its words concerning more cooperation with Turkey on foreign policy matters and on energy policy matters?
You also have a blue card from Mr. ZANYI. Would you accept also this question? Mr. ZANYI, go ahead.
Yes.
Mr. ZANYI, ask your question.
Köszönöm szépen, én nagyon rövid leszek, elnök asszony. Tisztelt képviselő úr, azt mondta a felszólásában.
Thank you very much, President. Now, you did say that your group was very divided by the subject of Turkey, or rather our group was divided on the subject of Turkey. I was wondering where the various groups were divided. What was the division you were talking about?
Mr. Preda, apparently you are the target of various blue cards. There's another one coming from Madam SAKORAFA. Would you accept this one too? So, Madam SAKORAFA, go ahead.
I would like to ask Mr. Preda, would he ask to open any chapter at the moment when in his countries, if they were burning ships, if you were threatened with the casus belli, if they were threatening your vital area, if you had a note issued by the Foreign Ministry of Turkey binding also our Greek islands, your islands, if they occupied half of your country, if all these things happened, would you talk about opening chapters if Turkey did all those things to your country?
This was the last one, so Mr. Preda, if you want to reply, please.
Thank you, Madam President. The energy security question. We all know that this is a very sensitive problem in our relations, not just with Turkey, but with other partner countries too. And the EPP is preparing to define a very clear position, including the external dimension of our security of energy supplies. Turkey, for its part, I think, can't have a strategic adversary in the European Union. In terms of the division in the EPP, well, we've got a shadow rapporteur who's spoken, and we'll see tomorrow what the situation is. It's not the time now for a seminar on that topic. Colleagues, I think, will realise that there's not a consensus on this matter. Lastly, on the final question on the opening of chapters, my opinion is that blocking the opening of new chapters with Turkey will mean giving up our position on certain issues such as foreign policy. Unfortunately, a few years ago we had a fairly similar position on foreign policy, but now things have changed a bit, and I think we need to have an intelligent approach to Turkey, and we shouldn't be stoked up by nationalist or populist passions on this matter. Thank you very much.
Next speaker is Mr. Howitt for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, President. First of all, I warmly congratulate my colleague Kati PIRI on this first report and recognise the very broad support she has in our group, even if other groups aren't able to say the same in theirs. For myself, let me be clear, there's someone who has argued for over a long period for constitutional reform in the country, as reflected in paragraph 6 of the report. That does not mean a super presidency as proposed by some, and 3 weeks ahead of the parliamentary elections it highlights the danger of any one party obtaining a majority which could threaten the need to win a cross-party consensus for any constitutional change. And I note the recent survey showing 60% of the Turkish public is against the adoption of the presidential system. Next, the Kurdish issue. The message for the European Parliament today for all parties is that the peace talks with the PKK must continue in good faith. Any question against this would be deeply ironic given the importance of the Kurdish population in bringing security to the region. And to those on the opposite sides of this House who have argued against the opening of chapters, let us address the regional unrest, because surely this supports the case in the resolution for opening the chapter number 31 on foreign policy. There is no strategy for promoting conflict resolution, counter-terrorism, non-sectarianism and non-proliferation across the whole of the Middle East and North Africa that does not seriously include Turkey within its process. And to those who are concerned about the new Gazprom deal announced between Russia and Turkey, by no means their first energy deal, this is an argument for opening the energy chapter to secure Europe's interest, not to fight shy of it. Above all, any member that is genuine in expressing concern about human rights and democracy in the country should join with us in calling for the opening of chapters 23 and 24 on fundamental rights. If Europe really is open to Turkish accession, it is these chapters which should be open most.
Thank you. Madam Fotyga, 1 minute.
Dziękuję, Pani Przewodnicząca.
Thank you very much, President. Poland was the first European country which opened diplomatic relations with Turkey some 600 years back. Those relations were tested in very difficult times for us when Poland was partitioned by her neighbours and disappeared from the European map. In an era of great geopolitical challenges, hybrid wars that you never know when it starts, when it ends, and how it happens in such a time, we must remember that Turkey is our ally. Thank you.
Mr. Ali, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to congratulate the rapporteur for her huge efforts on the preparation of the draft motion for a resolution and the intention to provide a suitable framework for EU-Turkey relations. Unfortunately, the last version has been modified and the whole philosophy of the motion has been changed. There is a disproportionate emphasis on the negative elements without referring to the positive steps undertaken by the Turkish government. Such approach could increase the Euroscepticism within the Turkish society and threaten the positive trend of public approval for EU membership. Instead of tolerating positive attitudes towards the EU within the society, we could achieve a negative effect. Analysis of a delegation's official visit to Ankara hasn't been taken under consideration. There is no clearly stated position on opening chapters, especially chapters 23 and 24, which could provide impetus to the Turkish government for implementation of reforms. Noting that Turkey plays a key role in the region regarding the refugees from the Middle East, it should be stressed that sustainment of almost 2 million Syrian refugees cost nearly $6 billion, while the financial and political support for the international community are very limited. Turkey has a strategic role as a partner of the EU and a member of NATO, and its geopolitical importance to address security and stability in the region is crucial. The cooperation between the EU and Turkey is of mutual interest, so we need each other in order to overcome the security challenges more than ever. Thank you.
Maybe, colleagues, you can stick to your time. That's the purpose of having a time. So, next speaker is Mr. Chrysogonos. 1 minute.
What we're discussing today has a bad title. It shouldn't be called Progress Report of Turkey as an accession country. A backward move report should be called, because that's what's happening in reality. We have a government, the Turkish government, replying to the accusations for corruption of its members by firing and dismissing the various judges and the prosecutors, and prohibiting YouTube and Twitter. It doesn't respect the freedom of expression nor the rule of law. A society such as the Turkish society, where young girls are obliged to be married in spite of their will, they're obliged by their families, does not respect the equality of the sexes. A country such as Turkey, that occupies militarily a part of the territory of another country, i.e. Cyprus, and makes illegal research in the continental shelf and does not agree with the national agreements and disputes the Greek sovereignty in some areas of the Aegean, it's a farce. It cannot be a candidate for the European Union. Thank you.
Madam Keller, 1 minute.
In der Türkei läuft vieles falsch.
A lot of things are going wrong in Turkey. The problems have been listed: minority rights, women's rights, freedom of expression, whether online or offline, media freedom, press freedom. There are lots and lots of problems out there, and the new law that's being used to criminalise demonstrators and activists has also been mentioned already. But because of all of these problems, this is exactly the right moment to try and take the accession process more seriously. An accession process is our best chance to try and support all of those people in Turkey who want to see change. If we simply turn our backs, then we will see no progress. Fundamental rights and justice have to be at the very heart of an accession procedure. These chapters need to be opened up. They should have been opened from the very outset. They should be better open now than later. Better late than never, certainly. So we need to strengthen the rule of law, strengthen democracy, to put some cards in the hands of the people who are active in Turkey. That's something we can only do with a serious, credible accession procedure.
1 minute and a half.
Yeah, thank you. This afternoon, part of the town of Palmyra in Syria fell to Islamic State. Palmyra is around the same distance from the border of Turkey as Strasbourg is to Frankfurt. Should Turkey become a member state, all the EU member states, and especially the UK, which I represent, would all have borders with Iran, Iraq and Syria. And let's be clear, the British Liberal Democrats, the British Labour Party and especially the British Conservatives, who should all be ashamed of themselves, are all cheerleaders for Turkey to become a member state of the European Union. I urge these parties and people over there, in their own national interest and in the interest of all member states, to consider that whatever the rationalisation may have been to have this pro-Turkish policy when it was formulated, the facts on the ground have changed. Turkey is no longer a credible candidate to be a member state of the European Union. Further, and this is a separate point, because our security would be at risk. Further, Turkey is a persistent and systematic violator of the human rights of its own people. If the European Union on human rights means anything, and I have to say I think it doesn't, there is no way that Turkey can ever be a member state. I urge members, therefore, to support my amendment tomorrow.
Mr. Mavrides, you have a blue card. Is it for Mr. Dartmouth or not?
To Ms. Keller. Can I have the chance to do that?
Let's ask her. Madam Keller, would you accept the blue card? So, then go ahead, Mr. Mavrides.
Yes. Θα ήθελα να ρωτήσω το εξής, επειδή έχει μιλήσει...
I have the following question. You talked about conjecture to open the road of Turkey to the European Union. If it wishes to do so, shouldn't it open an avenue in Turkey? To open the avenue, you could ask from Erdogan to withdraw the Turkish occupation forces from the European territory of the Republic of Cyprus, to support a solution based on the principles and values of the acquis communautaire. That's why we are in the European Union. This will show that we have political differences, that above all of us, however, are the rules of law of the European Union. What is your opinion concerning this? Thank you.
Madam Keller, 30 seconds.
Thank you. If I understood correctly, then you asked about the Cyprus question. And as the Commissioner was mentioning, I think we have now a unique window of opportunity that we need to use, and I think the European Union should do its utmost to support the resolution process in Cyprus. It's absolutely right that we have a big problem there. It's absolutely right that we should not have the Turkish army in Cyprus. Absolutely, but let's use that opportunity. Opportunities in the past have unfortunately not been used, but we should really go ahead now, because it really cannot be that we have this unresolved problem and crisis in the middle of the European Union. But I also think that Turkey that the accession process can be a vital tool also there to, let's say, give a little push towards a solution.
Mr. Ferrand, 1 minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I was going to say something rather conventional. I was just going to respond this evening to Mrs. Keller and to Mr. Ali. I would like to solemnly denounce the ambiguous role of Turkey vis-à-vis the Middle East, and I would denounce the ambiguous role that Turkey has vis-à-vis Europe. For 10 years here in the European Parliament, you've wanted to impose on us the entry of Turkey into the EU. I say no. No and no. I will oppose Turkey joining the European Union because they do not comply with the fundamental rules of the European Union. They are illegally occupying territory in Cyprus. They have not denounced the Armenian genocide. And now you want to be even stubborn enough to say that Turkey is a democratic country. Look at Gezi Park. Look at the Christian minorities. What you want to do is create a Turkish Europe, and I denounce that, and I denounce the fact that Turkey imposes its choice of civilization on the EU, because now it is jeopardizing our Christian acquis.
Well, we don't need to shout. We hear very well, and it's bad for headphones if we shout in the aula, so please keep your voice down. Next speaker is Mr. Milan Mon for 1 minute and a half.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, President. Relations between the EU and Turkey are very important. The European Union has ancient links with Turkey, including a customs union. And as we know, negotiations for membership of Turkey are still ongoing. There are still a great number of reforms necessary in Turkey. There needs to have to be respect for human rights, an independent judiciary. These are the kind of reforms that have to go ahead in Turkey. However, there is a difficult situation because of Syria and Iraq being direct neighbours of Turkey. There, of course, those are countries to which we are giving humanitarian aid. And also the European Union itself has neighbours in the southern Mediterranean which also are facing serious problems, and that's why we need close cooperation between Turkey and the EU in terms of security in the fight against terrorism. Also, it is essential that we cooperate with Turkey in the area of migration.
Also, we have to cooperate in the area of energy, because it's very necessary for us to diversify our sources of energy in Europe. And also, we have to keep Turkey informed of the negotiations we're going on, or we're continuing with the United States, the TTIP negotiations. Turkey also has a strategic place geographically for the European Union, and it is very important for our security. So it's very important for us to stay closely in touch with Turkey as regards regional security.
Do you accept a blue card from Mr. Dartmouth? Earl of Dartmouth. Would you, Mr. Milan Mon,
yes, yes.
Would you accept that?
Yes.
Then Mr. Dartmouth, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for taking the question. You mentioned, as almost nobody else has that I'm aware of, that Turkey is already a member of the EU Customs Union. As Turkey is already a member of the EU Customs Union, as you correctly and perceptively mentioned, why is it necessary for Turkey to become a full member state? Which means we have free movement of people, massive cohesion fund payments, and the rest.
Mr. Milan Mon, you have the floor.
Well, we have many things in common with Turkey. We have the customs union and many other things. And the thing is, Turkey is aspiring to total membership, and the customs union is only part, of course, of what we have in the European Union, full membership of the European Union, to which Turkey aspires.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Boștinaru, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, colleagues, let me say once again that the Socialists and Democrats support the Turkish accession to the European Union. I congratulate the rapporteur for her excellent report, for the extraordinary work put into it, for the compromises which will allow this report to be adopted. We have to choose between the isolation of Turkey suggested by some and the dialogue with this country, however difficult it might be, because we know that only in this way we can influence the evolutions in Turkey. We have to select between pushing Turkey towards Turkey and having cooperation with the Euro-Atlantic world. And there are 3 important directions that I would like to mention. Cooperation in humanitarian matters, where Turkey has important contributions because it takes up most of the refugees from Syria. Secondly, cooperation in foreign affairs and foreign policy in the fight against anti-terrorism and putting an end to financing for terrorist groups and putting an end to the traffic of weapons and foreign combatants. And thirdly, I support the importance of opening up Chapter 15 for energy. This is the only chapter which will allow us to reduce our dependency on the gas imports from Russia. Thank you.
So do I. Next speaker is Mr. Demesmaeker, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. It's almost a ritual that we are evaluating progress in relations with Turkey, but for every step forwards, the country takes 2 steps backwards. This year, too, we need a magnifying glass to discern any structural improvements, because after 10 years of accession negotiations, Turkey continues to have difficulties with fundamental freedoms of the freedom of the press, freedom of expression and freedom of worship. The way in which Ankara tried to cover up its huge corruption scandal is something the Commission condemns, and we can't turn a blind eye to that. Year after year, we're seeing more authoritarian tendencies manifesting themselves. And this is true of Mr. Erdogan as Prime Minister and now as President. And here we know that the parliamentary elections are going to take place in June, and Mr. Erdogan, if he gets more power, it might end up in a situation in which the country becomes an authoritarian state. So, what are we going to do about a country which is turning away from European standards and values to an increasing extent? And what about visa liberalisation and Turkey as a trading partner? Here we have to look at the breaches of the rule of law which are taking place.
SZAAKE, 1 minute.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, colleagues. The annual progress report has sadly become a regress report. The concerns we have on the rule of law, separation of powers, human rights and fundamental freedoms are now even more substantial than in previous years, as a result of the passing of security laws, restrictions in press and internet freedom, and an acknowledgement that evidence in a mass trial was actually doctored. That leads to key questions about fair trial and due process. I have always fought for the accession process, as I believed it would lead to a win-win for the people in the EU and Turkey alike. And I am sad to share how somber I am about where things stand. Now, are we only highlighting concerns? No. We also clearly stress the importance of updating the customs union and of a common, coordinated approach to foreign policy and humanitarian matters. But it must be crystal clear that an effective and credible EU-Turkey partnership can only be based on solidly shared values and a common understanding of democratic principles, such as laid down in the Copenhagen criteria. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam SCHAAKE. Next speaker is Mr. SYLIKIOTIS. 1 minute.
Dear colleagues, here a few months ago we condemned the violations of the Cyprus exclusive economic zone by Turkey. So why does the rapporteur today say that we should open up the energy chapter? First of all, they should sign and ratify the Convention on the Law of the Sea and recognize the Republic of Cyprus. The report and the resolution says that there have been positive steps, but we should insist that all the criteria of Copenhagen and the conventional obligations of Turkey should be respected. This is first and foremost in the interests of the Turkish people. We welcome the attempts to withdraw some of the occupation forces to implement 550 resolution and the additional protocol, and to contribute constructively on the basis of bizonal, bicommunal federation with one sovereignty and one international personality. But colonization should stop straight away. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Maragall, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to thank the Commission for the work it has been doing in negotiations. But first of all, we have to criticize the Turkish government for the way it is ignoring the basic rights of its citizens. And also, I think the European Union has not done enough to remind Turkey of its duties in this regard. Thirdly, we have to give a new impulse to negotiations in all the outstanding chapters, especially chapter 23, 24 and chapter 15. But also we have to ask the Turks to justify the positions of the majority party and the way it's abusing human rights in that country in the moment. Also, we have to talk to Turkey about its relations with Cyprus and the way it seeks to exclude Cyprus from the negotiating agenda. If we can achieve the necessary balance in negotiations, and that is, we have assurances on that, then we could give our support to this resolution. Europe, of course, would very much now like to conclude the negotiations with Turkey, which have been going on for 10 years already.
1 minute, please.
Thank you, President. I'd like to take this opportunity to wholeheartedly thank the colleagues who supported my candidature and the principle of pluralism in this House. I'd like to thank our colleague Piri for her work on this report. She's underscored quite rightly that accession could be a precious opportunity for Turkish democratization, but the real question we have to ask is whether Turkey really wants to use this opportunity. I don't think that so far it has taken the right course. Obviously, we know the major shortcomings in failure to respect EU values in the freedom of expression or media, etc. We know about the lack of reforms on the constitution with respect to the rights of the political opposition. And I probably don't even need to mention that 48,000 places between 2007 and 2014 were blocked by the Turkish authorities. Unfortunately, being anti-democratic. But until the Cyprus issue is resolved and the recognition of the Armenian genocide as well as fair treatment of the Kurds, I don't really think that Turkey is showing the will here. And I hope that in the June elections the Turkish people will express themselves very clearly.
Mr. Papadakis, 1 minute.
The report on progress of Turkey is an element in the accession procedure for the EU, which is a painful decision for the Turkish people and will mean new profits for the EU and Turkish monopolies. This report paves the way for opening new chapters, and thus it rewards the continuing occupation of Cyprus, the increased aggressiveness and the violations of Turkey of the Cyprus EOZ and the Greek airspace and maritime space. So the recent accolades of the European Commission to Turkey on the basis of the CFSP criteria reveal that the EU policy and the CFSP are dangerous for the peoples. And the recommendations and the wishful thinking that are repeated every year concerning the casus belli and Cyprus cannot hide the scheming of the great imperialist interests in the southeast Mediterranean. But the peoples have other criteria and interests, and they will fight against the EU and the monopolies and their scheming and their competition, and they can impose their own interests.
And a half.
Thank you, Chair. In the AFET committee, I voted for the report on Turkey, but I'm having second thoughts now. And that's because of the attempt for opening certain chapters. Why should we open chapters 23 and 24 on justice and individual rights when we can see what happened at the Gezi Park, the numerous arrests of journalists and the violations of human rights? Why should we open up chapter 15 on energy? This is a country that does not respect and doesn't ratify the Convention UNCLOS on maritime law, the laws of the sea, and at the same time it issues NAFTEX instructions for the EOZ of neighboring EU member states. Why should we open up chapter 31 concerning foreign policy and defense policy and security policy when we see that Turkey still retains the casus belli against a member state of the EU? It retains this casus belli. So 3 weeks before the Turkish elections, we present the Turkish government with a very nice present. The so-called criteria, the so-called benchmarks of the Council. This is what we should observe and not open up new chapters. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Kefalogiannis, would you take a blue card from Mr. Lambsdorff? Mr. Lambsdorff, 30 seconds.
Yes, just one short question, dear colleague. We were in the negotiations together in which you participated in your capacity as the chairman of the EP TGNA Joint Parliamentary Committee. Now, your statements now indicate that you have serious problems accepting vast swathes of Turkish policy making. Do you think you should continue in your function as chairman of the JPC? Because you apparently really have serious problems with that country.
Mr. Kefalogiannis, if you really want to answer this question.
Όντας τα δημοκρατικά σας συστήματα, αντιλαμβάνομαι ότι η ερώτηση σας είναι τουλάχιστον ατυχής. Γιατί γνωρίζετε...
On your question, as you know, I was not designated to my present position. I was elected, and not only that, I co-chair with my Turkish counterpart, who is entirely satisfied with the way I do my job, and I think it's a mistake on your part to put this question.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Lopez for 1 minute.
En primer lugar,
first of all, I'd like to thank the rapporteur, Ms. Kati PIRI, for the work she's done. It's been very hard work for her, very complex, and it's been very difficult for us to reach an agreement, the agreement we have today in the committee. Now, there's been a deterioration in democracy, the rule of law, the freedom of expression, independent judiciary in Turkey in the recent years. And all these developments are cause for concern. All of them have been expressed in this Parliament before. Nevertheless, we still have to work with Turkey in solidarity, because Turkey is important, an important country strategically, and it is receiving enormous numbers of refugees from its neighbouring countries. Also, it's an important country for us in terms of energy policy. Now, when it comes to the accession negotiations, those should provide us with the necessary lever we need in order to encourage the Turks to undertake the necessary reforms it should undertake to comply with the Copenhagen criteria.
Belder, 1 minute.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. I wanted to point out one thing to the Commission. On the 18th of April 2007 in Turkey, there was a triple murder of Christians. It was an appalling and horrible murder, and in fact even the perpetrators filmed what they were doing when they were committing the deed. So it seems that these suspects are at liberty, to the great consternation of the relatives. And in fact, it's something which the small Turkish Protestant community finds appalling, because it feels that it's not safe because of the intimidation that took place during the trial, and it wonders what the rights are of Christians in Turkey, what the law means to them. Now, I know that there have been 101 sittings already where we've asked for the Commission to ask questions and to inquire about what's happening about this murder trial with the perpetrators under house arrest but at liberty.
Madam SAKORAFA, 1 minute.
Madam Chair, it's 10 years since we started accession negotiations with Turkey. During these 10 years, Turkey continues to occupy with its armed forces European territory, half of Cyprus. It continues to violate systematically the sovereign rights of its neighbors. It ignores international conventions and decisions, for example, concerning the Cyprus EOZ on exploration, and it violates European airspace. Just the last 18 months, there have been about 2,700 such violations. If there's no withdrawal of the occupation forces from Cyprus, if the additional protocol is not implemented, if the Republic of Cyprus is not recognized, if the casus belli towards Greece, which is a member of the EU, is not lifted, and if these violations of the airspace and the maritime borders do not stop, no enlargement can take place, no chapter can open up, and no deepening of the customs union may take place. Dear colleagues, if we really want to develop our relations with Turkey, we should stand absolutely firm on these conditions. Thank you.
Mr. de Graaf, 1 minute.
President, Turkey has actually interrupted the progress that it's been making since Ataturk, because we're seeing that rights of women are being trampled underfoot inter alia. Now here we have now seen Turkey reveal its true agenda with the battle for Kobani, because here we're talking about a dangerous Islamist, Mr. Erdogan, leading the country. What is the EU doing? Well, what we're seeing is that not less, but more money is being sent to Mr. Erdogan. There's a megalomaniac palace which is being built, which is 5 times bigger than the White House. This country must never be allowed to join the EU. I demand from the Commission that it directly ends the funding of an Islamist dictatorship. And here we're talking about billions and billions that have been spent on a corrupt Turkey, and the negotiation process must be stopped right now, the accession process.
KOVATCHEV, 1 minute and a half.
Благодаря много, госпожо председател. Дълбоко съм убеден, че Европейския съюз трябва да продължи активно да подкрепя всеки в Турция.
The European forces are supporting Turkey, and I think it's very important for us to do that. It's very important for us to have a reliable partner in Turkey. Global challenges show that it's important for us to strengthen cooperation with Turkey, particularly when it comes to energy security, diversification, and having stability in the Middle East, as well as combating illegal migration. Accession negotiations with Turkey are open-ended, but they present an incentive for Turkey to embark on reforms so that the strategic partnership can be properly implemented. It's good that dialogue was reactivated recently, and that promotes mutual trust and further reforms in Turkey. The key areas here are fundamental rights and the rule of law. These are very important values without which accession may not happen. Ratification of the returns agreement is very important, but it does have to be properly implemented. Bulgaria and Turkey have a common border, and there's also an external border of the EU, so it's very important to have cooperation with Turkey and the authorities. Thank you.
Mr. KOVATCHEV, you have a blue card from Mr. Dzhambazki. Would you accept it? Yes? Then Mr. Dzhambazki.
Благодаря, госпожо председател. Уважаеми колега, как ще коментирате все по-авторитарното отношение и поведение на
Could I ask you how you would regard the very authoritarian behavior of the President of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan? Don't you think his attitudes is taking Turkey further away from the EU? Turkey seems to be striking its own way in the world away from the EU. Thank you.
Mr. Kovac, thank you very much, Mr. Dzhambazki. I've said that it's in our interest to support those people in Turkey who want integration and democracy. But what we're seeing, unfortunately, is not democratic development in the country. And of course, that means that Turkey is moving away from the European corridor. And of course, we shouldn't talk about full EU membership. The negotiations are open-ended, and that was made clear right from the start. And when in Luxembourg it was decided to open up negotiations with Turkey. If these negotiations are completed, then a decision will be taken about what's being intended, whether it's full membership or not, or whether the current status quo will be maintained, the customs duty. Personally, I think we should motivate those forces in Turkey who want democracy, who respect human rights, and also respect the rights of religious minorities. That's in the interest of the EU. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Papadakis, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. The relations of the EU and Turkey are at a crossroads. We must see, and the Turkish government must show what it really wants. Does it want its country to become a member of the European family? Lies, scheming, and hidden agendas should cease. The message from the European Union must be very clear. Turkey must prove through deeds that it respects human rights, the sovereignty of its neighboring states, and international law. the withdrawal of the Turkish occupation forces from Cyprus, the recognition of the Republic of Cyprus, the respect of the freedoms and rights of its own citizens, a solution to the Kurdish issue, and the respect for the principles and values of the EU should be the only way forward for Turkey. We want the Turkey in the EU as a force for peace and stability, and not as a factor of instability and problems in the area. Thank you.
Mr. Bashir, 1 minute.
Let me start by thanking the rapporteur for her hard work and balanced approach in dealing with this delicate matter. Regardless of the opinions held across this House, I think that we can all agree that it is in everyone's interest for Turkey to be a safe, democratic and prosperous country. While I take on board some of the concerns expressed by colleagues, I am afraid that the default negative position adopted by some keeps pushing Turkey further away instead of drawing it into the fold. Though this may be exactly what some want, we should not be surprised to see that constantly boxing Turkey out has frustrated Turkish moderates and fostered the isolationist sentiment that many in this House are so quick to condemn. Let us adopt a more cohesive approach that rewards positive developments. It is the only way that we will be able to genuinely evaluate whether or not the EU can take its relationship with Turkey to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Borghezio, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, President. Let's speak clearly. Turkey is a large regional power that has no intention and possibly no interest of fulfilling its huge, or rather has no desire to put an end to its expansionism. We can see Cyprus, what's happening there. It isn't being defended. Now, not only the criticisms of the opposition should make us wake up. Turkey's ambiguous comments on terrorism, 50,000 terrorists apparently, according to the opposition, but also international organizations who already in 2014 talked about arms being produced in the conflict areas. So that's been demonstrated. And Mrs. Mogherini is saying that we will have to ask Turkey to trace all these arms, but when are they going to reply to that? Now, the result is that Erdogan's Turkey is making fun of us. It's led by a leader who acts with threats to peaceful words from the Pope. Now, he doesn't use the word genocide, but that's because they're worried about it. Now, it's our duty to remember the genocide of the Armenians. Now, you're cowardly in Europe, aren't you? You just don't dare stand up to them.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed for your understanding. I think that you indicated that you would prefer not to continue participating in the debate, which I think was a prudent decision. But, of course, you might want to take the floor later on. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Theokarous for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. The report on Turkey is unacceptable because it marginalizes the Republic of Cyprus and creates dangers for it. It dissociates the Cyprus issue from the accession procedure. It calls for opening new chapters without Turkey having respected its obligations towards the Cyprus Republic and the Union. It asks for deepening the customs union without Turkey having implemented the additional protocol, and it does not include the paragraph on Cyprus of the Counter Declaration of the 21st of September, which is an integral part of the community acquis, and says that there is only one recognized by the EU state on the island, the Cyprus Republic, which became a member of the Union as a united state on the basis of Protocol 10. It allows Turkey to take part in the CFSP while the Turkish armed forces are still occupying Cyprus, and the Turkish fleet violates every day our seas. If the European Parliament votes for this report, there is a serious danger of a dissolution of the Republic of Cyprus, which will become protectorate of Turkey, and this protectorate will be a Trojan horse for millions of Islamists to come into Europe. The European Parliament has no competence to decide on the state form of the solution of the Cyprus issue, and therefore promoting a specific solution which legitimizes the continuing war crime committed by Turkey against Cyprus is a serious danger for the Union. The European Parliament has a moral obligation to make sure that this solution will be based on the values of the EU, and it will consolidate the human rights of the Cyprus people. And concerning the refugees that are protected by Turkey, let's remember for how many million refugees Turkey is responsible.
Card from Mr. Frunzulică. Do you accept it? Mr. Frunzulică.
Thank you very much. This is maybe a food for thought for my Greek and Greek Cypriots friends and colleagues that I appreciate very much. Mrs. Theokaros, don't you think so that issues with Turkey could be settled easier in the process of Turkey's accession to the European Union? Because if Turkey is kept aside the European Union, things are becoming more difficult. And this situation has to be used by all of us. Thank you.
Please switch on the micro.
I've said repeatedly that yes, we would want a democratic neighboring country, progressive and modern, who would protect, since it is a very strong country, protect all the small peoples around it. Unfortunately, Turkey wants to join the European Union on its own terms and to decide on the European Union itself. There are no democratic changes that would make us feel safe. If you feel safe with this kind of Turkey, which does not respect its own people and violates its fundamental rights, what can I say? I've nothing to add. Yes, we want a democratic Turkey as a member of the EU so that we may feel better and safer.
Next speaker is Mr. Freund in 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President.
Now, if there's a difficult report, well, certainly that's the case for the progress report on Turkey. That's why I'd like to thank Kati PIRI for having taken this up so well. Now, it's no secret that there are many different interests at play. The interests of those who never want to see Turkey in the EU, the ongoing conflict with Cyprus and Greece, the so-called Western NATO member on the one hand, on the other side Turkey, which is turning away more and more from these Western values, EU values. What about the way they treat journalists or the abuse of internet for political means? Turkey plays an important role in the Middle East conflict and has taken up more than 4 times the number of refugees that the whole of Europe has taken up. So all these contradictions, and I hope that in the interest of the EU and Turkey in the next report, the number of these contradictions will have gone down. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Marias.
Madam Chair, Turkey continues its provocations towards Cyprus and Greece. Just a few hours ago, Turkish fighter aircraft violated once more Greek airspace between Chios and Samos. And while Turkey continues to occupy illegally 37% of the territory of the Republic of Cyprus, an EU member state, the EU continues to stroke Cyprus, and they propose opening up more chapters of the accession dialogue. Turkey doesn't even recognize the Republic of Cyprus. It maintains the casus belli towards Greece if it decides to extend its territorial waters to 12 miles. Turkey puts in doubt the sovereign rights of Greece and Cyprus. But at the same time, the report tries to upgrade the political dialogue between Turkey and the Union. So it is a completely unacceptable report. I am against any future accession of the EU to the of Turkey to the EU.
The next speaker is Mr. Obermeier for 1 minute.
Frau Vorsitzende.
President, it's really regrettable that in this important debate there are so few colleagues in the chamber. On the other hand, I'm very pleased to see that the public gallery is full of young people, and I'd like to greet my fellow countrymen in the gallery from Austria. Now, with regard to Turkey, we really have to look at what is happening in that country. We have reports from the Commission this week showing that the aid to Turkey has gone up from 700 to 750 million euros per year, and there's no progress being made in terms of the political situation in the country. And at the same time, there are infringements of the rule of law by the government. There are the restrictions on freedom of speech and freedom of expression. The relations with Cyprus are poor, and all this under the encouragement of the President, Mr. Erdogan, with his extremely strong Islamic tendencies. The question is freedom possible in Turkey? 70% of my fellow countrymen would say this doesn't seem to be the case. I think it's better to break off the negotiations and try and find other solutions. Thank you very much.
The next speaker is Mr. Képesh for 1.5 minutes. You have the floor. Honourable President, Turkey has stated its intention to join the Union and has shown a willingness to introduce effective reforms, establish good neighbourly relations, and to adopt the necessary international standards. Nevertheless, in Turkey, freedom of expression and the press is still not being guaranteed. The legal framework for the fight against corruption is still not in place. The separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary still leave a lot to be desired. And Turkey's relations with its neighbours continue to be very strained. Turkey has a role of strategic importance in terms of eastern and southern neighbourhood, and in particular in the fight against Syrian and Iraqi terrorism. Similarly, it plays an important role in relation to the energy security of supply in Europe. Bearing all of this in mind, we have to continue the cooperation we have entered into with Turkey. Nonetheless, the dialogue between Europe and Turkey has to remain founded on values. We may justifiably expect that Turkey should live up to the commitments it has entered into itself as far as guarantee of fundamental rights is concerned, and it should refrain from any action which has a detrimental effect on neighbourly relations. It should sort out its relations with Greece and Cyprus and normalise its relations with Armenia. A century after the Armenian genocide, this step cannot be delayed any further. Thank you very much indeed. Now, Honourable Member Androulakis for 1 minute.
We all understand that Turkey is an important partner of the EU, but the progress and the normal continuation of the accession negotiations depend exclusively on Turkey. As it says in our resolution, it should go forward the necessary reforms. It should respect fully the Copenhagen criteria. There should be the rule of law, independent justice, and freedom of the press and the media. These are core values of the Union, and Turkey should respect them. Furthermore, Turkey should normalize its bilateral relations. Actions such as the continuing violations of Greek airspace, the illegal explorations of the seas, and its refusal to lift the casus belli against Greece and to recognize the Cyprus Republic should cease. We want a Turkey which should be a base for stability in the region, respecting the European values and the community acquis.
Thank you, Mr. Androulakis. You have a blue card. Do you accept it? Mr. Kichuk, you have the floor.
Благодаря, госпожо председател. Господин Androulakis, аз идвам от Балканите. Единственият...
I'm from the Balkans, and the only way to not allow old problems to get out of hand, it's important for Turkey and Cyprus to be able to solve their problems in a European context when both of them are part of the EU.
Obviously, the Balkans are a region where these recent decades there have been very difficult situations. But what I understand should be done should be the respect for European rules. As long as Turkey does not adopt such a strategy, it is obvious that there can be no normalization of its relations, and all attempts to go forward with the accession negotiation will be undermined by its extremist strategy.
Mr. Vistisen, the next speaker.
As time goes by, it becomes increasingly apparent that it was a mistake to enter into accession negotiations with Turkey. Turkey is an incredibly important player in the region. It's a member of NATO, and it ought to be a democratic society with which our cooperation is self-evident and natural. Unfortunately, things are going the wrong way for Turkey. Today, what we're seeing is a situation in which the freedom of expression, the freedom of the press, freedom to assemble and demonstrate is being trodden underfoot. And in fact, what we're seeing is that Turkey is not moving towards a Western democracy, but it's drifting away from that, drifting away from the Western world. So I think it's abundantly clear that by offering the prospect of joining the EU, we've achieved the opposite effect to the one we desired. And if this development continues, I hope that we will stop the accession process rather today than tomorrow. The next speaker is Mr. Kukan for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, I would like to thank the rapporteur for the good work on this progress report. I think we should see the EU integration process as a vehicle to enhance reforms in the country. We need to stay focused on the reforms processes, such as strengthening rule of law, independence of judiciary, and unconditional respect for fundamental freedoms, including freedom of association, expression, and freedom of media. Turkey should be encouraged to intensify its dialogue with the EU and the Venice Commission in order to converge to the EU acquis. I would also like to stress the importance of Turkey as a major regional and international player. In the security context, Turkey remains a key NATO ally, which can play an increasingly positive and constructive role in all regional constellations. This includes relations with the EU member states, EU candidate countries in the Western Balkans, and Turkey's troubled neighbourhood in the southeast. We need to see an increased complementarity in EU's and Turkey's foreign and security policy issues. In the current security environment, a closer relation between Turkey and the European Union is to the benefit of both. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kukan. You have a blue card from Mr. Epitideos. Do you accept it? Yes. Mr. Epitideos, you have the floor.
Dear colleague, Mr. Kukan, bearing in mind the behavior until now of Turkey, what makes you believe that this country is really interested of joining the European Union, that it really wants to implement the necessary reforms that you mentioned quite rightly? What makes you believe that if it becomes a member of the Union, on its terms, not on the terms that it should, it will become, on its terms, a support for security? All those wonderful words that we say will become reality if Turkey joins.
Distinguished colleague, first of all, I do not believe that Turkey will become EU member on its own terms. You are underestimating the European Union if you say that. And I didn't say that I believe. I said that Turkey, whether you like it or not, is a candidate country which is going through the accession negotiations. Whatever you say, this is the truth. And I always repeat that the European Commission is the body which defines with whom we are going to start the accession negotiations, and it's a process. Nobody wants to accept Turkey now. It's a matter of years. I don't know how this process is going to end. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Zahradil in 1 minute.
Paní předsedající, Turecko.
Thank you, Madam President. In the last 12 years, Turkey has changed. Now, in a way that previously Turkey hadn't changed for decades, and I'm rather concerned that we're not reflecting this change. Now, of course, some of the changes are not to our liking, but we have to take note of them and respect them. Turkey is changing its domestic policy and its external policy. It's more assertive. And Turkey is still a central geopolitical player, also when it comes to security and the EU's security and security of energy supply. So I think we need to strengthen Turkey in its approach with refugees. If it hadn't taken on refugees from Iraq and Syria, they'd be in the EU by now. We are condemned to work with Turkey, and if we were to stop the funding, that would be a terrible signal. Thank you.
Mr. Zahradil, you have a blue card. Do you accept it? Yes. Mr. Osorovic, you have the floor. Please switch on your micro, maybe. It's better.
Thank you indeed. President, dear colleague, I do appreciate your constructive approach towards Turkey's involvement into the reform process. Indeed, I do appreciate this, and we should follow this line in evolving into constructive and indeed reforms process of Turkey. But would you envisage any new instruments for Turkey, what especially the European Commission should provide in order to speed up and make these reforms irreversible? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I don't think and I don't see the necessity of introducing any new measures or any new instruments. I think, and I can only repeat what my predecessor, Mr. Kukan, has said, that we are in the course of negotiation process. I think that any international organization and the European Union first and foremost should be measured concerning its trustworthiness, also according whether it is able to fulfill its promises. And once we have started the negotiation process, we have to go on with that, and we have to make a final evaluation at the end of this process, not to stop it in the meantime, or to change the conditions in the meantime.
Következő hozzászólás.
The next speaker is Anna Maria Corazza-Bildt for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The European Parliament is sending mixed messages to Turkey. We call for accelerating reforms, but we slow down on the prospects for membership. Why should we have a say in the internal policies if we then tell them Europe will never be your home? Accession negotiation is the highway to change. I do share concerns regarding censorship, freedom of expression, independent judiciary, but I do think that opening the chapters on justice and fundamental freedom is the best way to promote the democratic reforms. We should also move forward on the visa liberalization. This is not about rewarding the current government. This is about engaging long-term to build trust with the people of Turkey. We must look beyond the rhetoric and actions coming from Ankara now. Yes, more needs to be done, but we do see some progress in the peace process with the Kurdish community, dialogue on Cyprus, readmission agreement, and the Istanbul Convention on violence against women. Being punitive does not lead anywhere. Let's be pragmatic. Turkey is strategic for the EU. We share major challenges: migration, human trafficking, terrorism and jihadism, energy and trade. Let's be clear, Turkey is not ready to become a member yet, but let's give them the same chance as other candidate countries without double standards. Our uncertainty has a price, Madam Chair, and I conclude. Undermining pro-European consensus and policies in Turkey. Is it really Turkey who is turning the back to Europe, or are we turning our back to the people of Turkey? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Corazza-Bildt. You have a blue card from Mrs. Theokaros. Do you accept it? Yes. You have the floor. Please, micro. Yeah.
Madam Bildt, how do you consider the fact that Cyprus implements the readmission agreements with 27 member states, but not with the Republic of Cyprus, which it insults by calling it with a term that I will not translate to you from the Turkish? And how do you judge the fact that the citizens of Cyprus cannot get a visa if they do not accept that they belong to the Southern Cypriot administration of Southern Cyprus? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to say that there has been just in the past week progress in confidence-building measures in resolving the conflict in Cyprus. I do not think that using the fact that you are a member of the European Union constantly just to harass and attack Turkey is constructive for long-term, fair, win-win solution for all the people of Cyprus. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor Mr. Tannock.
Madam President, despite the Turkish government's declaration that its priority is EU membership, today's progress report shows this wanting. Human and civil rights, particularly for journalists, continue to be undermined, and corruption is widespread. The opportunity for reopening talks with Cyprus following the welcome election of Mustafa Kinci in occupied northern Cyprus has been undermined by Ankara's attitude to Cyprus's oil exploration rights. Meanwhile, Turkey, in spite of NATO membership, remains ambivalent at best towards ISIS terrorism and hostile to Israel. It is also regrettable on the centenary of the Armenian genocide that Turkey refuses to open the border with Armenia or recognise this historic crime. Meanwhile, President Erdogan continues to aggrandise his office into that reminiscent of an Ottoman sultan while boosting his ties with Putin's Russia.
Turkey has great geopolitical potential, as has been said by many, as a strategic country with huge economic and energy security roles and a vibrant and rich culture. Let us hope that the muted tone of the PIRI report will be the beginning of a rapprochement rather than the harbinger of deteriorating relationship between Turkey and the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, Ms. Šuica, for 1.5 minutes.
Hvala vam lijepa. Evo, prošlo je 10 godina.
Thank you very much. Well, as we've heard already many times, 10 years have passed since negotiations opened with Turkey. My homeland, Croatia, has now been a member of the EU for 2 years, but the situation in Turkey still hasn't improved. Now, obviously, Turkey is a very important strategic partner for us, and therefore we have to continue our relations with Turkey. At the same time, we shouldn't forget that the human rights situation in Turkey is not exactly favourable. The executive gets involved with the judiciary, and freedom of opinion and freedom of speech is not as it should be, and the LGBT community in Turkey is also repressed, and all sorts of United Nations resolutions are not complied with. And all of these facts are grist to the enemies of Turkey and certainly to the opponents of Turkish accession. I think we should appeal to Mr. Erdogan to work for better relations with the EU and also for a less strident Islamic posture in his own country. We all know how important Turkey is for the EU. It's important that Turkey ultimately accept European values, and we should continue quietly to encourage them to do so.
Thank you. Now, Jambarski for 1 minute.
Категорично не споделям ентусиазма в част от.
I cannot share the enthusiasm by some people in this room about progress made in Turkey, or the so-called progress. The government today is not a democratic government in terms of European values that are so often talked about here. In external policy, we can see what's happening. There's a lack of democracy, a support of the military in dealings with Cyprus, also the dealings with migrants from Bulgaria. That undermines the security of our country. Turkey is taking action against Bulgaria. Bulgaria is a member of the EU. Journalist rights are trampled on, and the separation of powers is not adhered to. Those in this room who consider themselves to be Democrats should know that in Turkey there's nothing to celebrate. It's not democracy. Those who haven't understood that will have to pay.
Our next speaker is Ms. Esther de Lange. Thank you, Madam President. A great deal has already been said in the course of this debate. On the one hand, the rapporteur has put a lot of work into this report, and there's been criticism, correctly so, because over the last few weeks and months what's been going on in Turkey is incompatible with European values, and a number of examples have already been cited. On the other hand, the report talks about opening up new chapters with Turkey in the negotiations. I think in Ankara this will be viewed as encouragement and a reward, although there is no grounds to be joyful. Now, here, if we don't want to close the door on Turkey, we have to keep talking with this important neighbour. We have to continue to gauge and keep an eye on progress and important benchmarks, and we have to continue to support initiatives towards the rule of law. But perhaps we ought to look what's going on directly in the eye, because here we seem to be acting as if we've got blinkers on and looking only, solely and exclusively at membership. Now here, I think it's perhaps better to invest in an alternative partnership on the basis of a critical spirit. And sometimes we should depart from the trodden path and the standard course. The EPP is certainly interested in looking at alternatives in a constructive spirit, and I hope that this realism is something that other colleagues will subscribe to. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Valenza, for 1 minute.
Dziękuję, Pani Przewodnicząca. Jak co roku spotykamy się tutaj, aby ocenić, czy jak...
Thank you, President. Well, every year we consider the progress report on Turkey. And today I would like to focus on one important aspect. Here I am concerned about court cases involving journalists. Journalists are being arrested for various reasons, some of which include the way they deal with the terrorist issues in the press and the way they approach terrorist cases. Now, in Turkey, ladies and gentlemen, there are enormous amounts of court cases being taken out against journalists, and in the European Union we have to insist that these court cases against journalists should be conducted in such a way that they enjoy their full legal rights.
The next speaker is Mr. Benson for 1 minute.
Benson, you have...
Thank you.
Turkey is an important strategic partner for the EU. That applies in political terms, in economic terms, and perhaps in the European Parliament we might be able to make a compromise on the Copenhagen criteria from '93, because they've got an economic and a political criteria. The economic one is about a functioning market economy, which wouldn't give problems. But what about the political criteria? Because here we're talking about stable institutions which guarantee democracy, respect for human rights, the rule of law, and protection of minorities. But what we agreed on in 1993 when accession negotiations were launched is something which we have to readdress, because the Turkey doesn't live up to the criteria, it doesn't have democratic values, because we're seeing leaders of trade unions and others being persecuted, and the same is true of religious minorities. So here, colleagues in the chamber are talking about opening up new chapters. So here, if Turkey had been a small country, we would have shut the door on them. I think we should talk about a partnership instead. Thank you. The last speaker is Mr. Christofourou.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, if we really wanted to be frank, we should say that Turkey did not succeed the exams whether it should join the Union. And I ask all of our colleagues to tell me if there's been even a small step forward in the basic issues. Turkey continues in its non-respect of the Ankara Protocol, which is an insult towards all the member states. It continues to defy international law and the law of the sea. It continues to violate rights within its borders and without. It continues to occupy European territory, and it has made 200,000 Cyprus citizens into refugees. The possibility of opening new chapters is a provocation, and it would be seen as a reward for Turkey. So it will have no incentive whatsoever to improve its behavior. But I would like to say that at this moment there is a constructive dialogue on a solution of the Cyprus issue, and I'd like to ask us all to contribute for a just and viable solution of the Cyprus issue on the basis of the positive part of the report on a reunification of Cyprus, the return of Famagusta, respect of human rights, respect of values and principles that until now it has not respected.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of the individual speakers list, and now we're going to have the catch the eye procedure. I would like to give everyone the floor, so I'd like you to stick very strictly to your 1 minute speaking time. The first speaker is Mr. Csaba Sógor.
Please switch on.
Thank you, Madam President. I welcome the fact that the Foreign Affairs Committee has tabled an amendment which specifically mentions the importance of reconciliation with the Kurdish community and urges at the same time that the Turkish government strengthen the cultural and political rights of the Kurds as well as the equal treatment to which they are entitled. Associating myself with AFET's appraisal, I too deem it important that the European Commission set aside resources for programmes promoting the social and economic integration of people living in the reintegration of people living in the southeast part of Turkey in the interest of bolstering the Kurdish settlement process. In all of this, one key point is to realise the rights of national minorities, and particular attention has to be paid to improving the situation of the Kurdish community. I hope that this issue will be given appropriate emphasis within the accession process. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Caputo.
Presidente.
Thank you, President. Turkey is a strategic partner of the EU. In 2005, negotiations were opened, and since then a lot of progress has been made, but there are still many outstanding issues. For example, episodes that have raised doubts about the independence and impartiality of the judiciary, the separation of powers and respect of the rule of law that are all the focus of the Copenhagen criteria. There's also a corruption index from Transparency International that puts Turkey at the 64th place, but also relationship with the media. Reporters Without Frontiers has said that Turkey is one of the countries where journalists have been most exposed to threats and physical violence. Turkey needs to do much more to satisfy the Copenhagen criteria, and it's time now to align the EU parameters and to ensure that there's proper reforms in Turkey. Turkey will have to make these efforts and strengthen its institutions as well as its democratization process. That's absolutely essential if it can be considered a mature, advanced country.
Mr. Jakovčić.
U ovome parlamentu vrlo često govorimo, svaki puta na svakoj sjednici, naime govorimo o problemima migracije.
President, often in the European Parliament we talk about problems pertaining to refugees, to energy, security and so on. And in this context, Turkey is an ally of ours. And Turkey at the moment is trying to deal with something approaching 2 million refugees. It's also an important partner for us in terms of energy. So it's an important partner. And that means we still have to carry on talking about how we can get closer to Turkey, how can we encourage Turkey to join the EU. It is an ally of ours. But this, of course, means that if Turkey is going to join the EU, it's going to have to make enormous changes in terms of reorganizing its democracy, otherwise it can't become a member of the EU. Nevertheless, we have to carry on talking openly to Turkey in negotiations and take advantage of every opportunity we can to make progress in these negotiations. Thank you very much.
Mr. Glezos, you have the floor.
The core issue that we should deal with is one and only. There is a resolution of the UN, of the Security Council, calling upon Turkey to withdraw its troops of invasion and occupation of Cyprus. This should be our starting point. Why it has not implemented the resolution of the UN. And furthermore, there has been ethnic cleansing of the occupied territory in northern Cyprus. 200,000 Turkish Cypriots had to leave because there has been an ethnic cleansing. Who has spoken about this until now? We hear a lot about our major strategic partner. I ask them to take back these statements, because I would like to state openly that they are on the payroll of Turkey. And if they want, they can take me to court. I'd like to go to court so that this issue may be investigated.
The
next speaker is Mrs. Colleen Langen.
Frau Präsidentin.
Madam President, for 15 years now, Turkey has been an accession candidate. 10 years ago, the accession negotiations were opened. Since then, unfortunately, there hasn't not just been no progress. Instead, we've seen steps being taken backwards. Turkey has become ever more distant from European values such as freedom of expression, assembly, press freedom, etc. Now, we really have to point this out. It doesn't mean that Turkey is not an important partner of the EU in many respects. So we have to ponder for a moment what the state of relations is. We have to reassess these relations and place them on a new foundation. Thank you.
Next speaker is Mr. Mavrides.
Thank you. Firstly, I would like to thank my colleague, Ms. Kati PIRI, for the work that she has done, which was not easy at all. However, since I'm one of the last speakers, I'd like to say that I believe that almost all speakers before me, starting from the left and going all over the room to the hemicycle to the right, this progress report does not contain any progress. And so a question to all of us, the following. The procedure that led us to this point, and I'd like to speak to Mr. Van Orden as well. This procedure started 10 years ago when the Republic of Cyprus did something which many would never do. Although 1/3 of its territory was occupied by Turkey, it decided to agree on starting negotiations with Turkey. And we've reached this point today. So, is there no other way other than opening new chapters all the time? This is a question, Mr. Van Orden, and please do not call...
Now, you're taking away speaking time from somebody else, because you have 1 minute. Next speaker, Mr. Frunzulică.
Thank you very much. Yes, Turkey still faces issues considering the freedom of press, freedom of justice, freedom of internet, the construction of the Ilisu Dam and AQU nuclear plant. But at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, by all means, Turkey is a strategic partner of the European Union in security and defense issues, on energy security, on economic issues, and on foreign policy as well. Its strategic importance for the EU is of outstanding importance in addressing challenges and threats in eastern and southern neighbourhood of Europe. Turkey is a bridge between Europe, the Middle East and Asia, a country strong both economically and militarily, and a single unique NATO member close to the Middle East, Central Asia and Caucasus. Ladies and gentlemen, is by all means European Union needs Turkey and Turkey needs the European Union, and all the issues with Turkey can be settled in the negotiating process of accession of Turkey to the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. The last speaker is Cristian Dan.
Gracias, Presidenta. Me gustaría incidir.
Thank you, President. 3 points which this Parliament, I think, could be more robust and effective on. First of all, take the PKK off the terrorist list in the European Union, and then have Mr. Öcalan, the journalist, released immediately. And of course, we have to insist on better treatment for the Kurdish people. There has to be a sustainable peace negotiated with the Kurds. And then they have to open their borders for humanitarian aid. Now, as regards the elections, the election campaign there have been violent incidents, and we have to insist in Ankara that they should not tolerate such attacks during an election process and indeed during the Kurdish peace process.
Honourable colleagues, we have now reached the end of the list of speakers, and I'd now like to invite the Commissioner to take the floor to respond. Go ahead, sir.
Madam Chairwoman, honourable members, dear colleagues, I would like to thank all members of this House who expressed support for the Commission's comprehensive agenda with Turkey. This includes work in crucial areas such as energy, migration, economy and the modernisation of the customs union. This recognises the importance of the shared challenges in EU-Turkey relations. The Commission is committed to develop these relations further. Of course, I also share many of your concerns, the rule of law and fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of assembly and freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and of course the independence of the judiciary are all core principles of democratic societies, of course. It's up to Turkey to ensure that both the legal framework and its implementation in these areas are in line with European standards. The Commission is prepared to work with the new Turkish Parliament and government on these issues. Now, regarding the Cyprus issue, on Cyprus, I would like to echo the comments made here today that there is now a window of opportunity to find a lasting solution to this very crucial issue. The Commission would like to encourage all involved to make decisive progress in the settlement talks with the support of the UN. Such progress could also add new momentum to Turkey's accession process. To conclude, the Commission underlines that we must be prepared to step up our efforts in further engaging with Turkey after the upcoming elections. The enlargement process provides the most suitable framework for cooperation and reforms. Thank you so much for your attention and for this very rich discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I give the floor Mrs. Kalniņa-Lukaševica.
Thank you, Madam President, honourable members. The debate today clearly shows that we need to continue to encourage political and economic reforms in Turkey. This is the best way forward, and we should continue down this road. Answering the question by Mr. Lambsdorff on whether the EU is the author of reforms in Turkey, the Council's answer is clear. Both sides, including Turkey, have much to gain from the process of political and economic reforms. During the debate, many of you also mentioned energy issues. Let me assure you that the Council fully supports the strengthening of the EU-Turkey energy cooperation with the aim of facilitating and integrating energy markets. Here, I would like to refer also to the proposal by the Commission on Energy Union, which points out Turkey as an important strategic energy partner. The EU is committed to develop energy and climate diplomacy where it can use all its foreign policy instruments.
In this debate, we also heard several members calling the opening of further negotiation chapters, for example of 23rd and 24th. Let me recall that negotiating chapters may only be opened in compliance with the rules of the Intergovernmental Conference, according to the established procedures and in line with the negotiation framework. Unanimity in Council is required for this process. As a Presidency, we are committed to continue the process. Together with the Member States and the Commission, we are doing what we can to move things forward. I would not take more time, but conclude by recalling that, ultimately, it is Turkey's own ability and willingness to move forward which will determine the pace of the negotiations. Turkey's own progress in addressing benchmarks, as well as the requirements of the negotiating framework and the accession partnership, continues to be the primary determining factors. Advancing the negotiations will not only require further general reform efforts, but also a great deal of political courage from Turkey. We join the Commission in expressing hope that the EU agenda in Turkey after the elections will be re-energized. I thank you very much for this debate and thank you very much once again for your attention.
Thank you very much. Képviselőtársaim.
Honourable colleagues, a motion for resolution has been tabled to conclude the debate. And today I conclude the debate and I would like to inform you that the vote will take place tomorrow. And I would now like to call the next item on the agenda, statement by the Vice President of the Commission, High Representative of the Union, who will be making a statement on the situation in Ethiopia. I would now like to give the floor to on behalf of the Vice President, to Commissioner. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Again, dear colleagues, in this next matter, on behalf of the High Representative Federica Mogherini, I welcome the opportunity to discuss the situation in Ethiopia just 4 days before elections take place. It is indeed important that we can exchange views on this very important country. To start with, the Commission wishes to recognise Ethiopia's active role and regional and international efforts to build a more secure and peaceful Horn of Africa region. Ethiopia is notably leading IGAD mediation efforts in South Sudan and has contributed a significant number of troops to the African Union mission to Somalia. In particular, fighting Al-Shabaab with considerable success. This illustrates Ethiopia's importance as a partner for the European Union in terms of regional peace and stability. We have common interests and similar positions on a number of global issues. On migration and displacement, for instance, Ethiopia is a key country of origin, transit as well as destination. It is host to over 680,000 refugees, with all the difficulties this entails. It is actively involved in the Khartoum process. The recent killing of Ethiopian Christian migrants by ISIS in Libya have brought the issue of migration as well as terrorism to the top of the agenda in Ethiopia, and the government has expressed an interest in expanding cooperation on these matters with the European Union. On climate change, Ethiopia's policy in global discussion is in line with European Union position. The European Union intends to sign the Lehman Declaration on cooperation with Ethiopia, as several EU member states have already done. In terms of economic development and poverty reduction, Ethiopia is considered in many ways a success story for Africa. The assistance that the EU and its member states have been providing is bearing fruit in terms of progress towards Millennium Development Goals and social and economic growth. IMF estimates for economic growth in the current year, 2015, is 7.5 to 8.5%, which is rather impressive for the region. Moreover, according to a recent report by the World Bank, poverty in Ethiopia fell by 1/3 between 2000 and 2011. These are remarkable achievements, and I'm glad that our support contributed to achieving this. But we all know there is another side to the coin. As in many post-conflict situations, democratic transition in Ethiopia is taking that time and does not always go smoothly. The Commission is well aware that the political environment is not